Welcome back to the deep dive. We like to tackle those big philosophical concepts here. And today, we're diving into one that's a real classic, one of those ideas that even someone who's never cracked open a philosophy book probably has an opinion on. We're talking about exploitation.
And I have to say, you've really outdone yourself with the source material this time. We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, that's the SEP, for those in the know, articles from some of the giants in the field. It's going to be a good one.
It's going to be dense in the best way possible, of course. So exploitation, it's one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, in everyday conversations. But when we really try to pin down what it means, things get complicated fast.
No kidding. The SEP starts us off with a definition that sounds pretty straightforward: taking unfair advantage of someone. Basically, using another person's vulnerability to benefit yourself.
Okay, I think we can all kind of nod our heads at that, right? But like I said, it gets tricky because
Yeah.
it doesn't that describe a lot of interactions if you think about it? We're always looking for an edge, right?
Right. That's the thing. The SEP makes it clear that not every instance of benefiting from someone's vulnerability is automatically morally wrong. They give the example of a chess player. A good chess player is going to exploit their opponent's weaknesses. That's how you win. But we wouldn't say that's exploitation in the ethical sense.
Right. There's a difference between being strategic and being exploitative. So where's the line? What makes an advantage unfair?
That's where philosophers get busy, right? Trying to unpack these distinctions. And one important one that SAP points out is the difference between two main types of exploitation. You've got transactional exploitation, where the unfairness is like right there in the specific deal being made. Think of those classic examples of like a sweatshop paying poverty wages or someone price gouging during an emergency.
Yeah, those feel pretty clear-cut, don't they? And then there's the other kind, structural exploitation, right? That's about how entire systems or institutions can be exploitative, even if any individual transaction within them doesn't seem obviously unfair.
That's a big one, yeah. The SF gives some interesting examples from feminist philosophy, like some feminists argue that traditional marriage as an institution can be seen as structurally exploitative because it might reinforce gender inequalities even if individual couples seem to benefit.
It's about those deeper power dynamics that shape the choices people make,
Yeah.
right? Now, here's a thought that occurred to me while reading these materials. Can exploitation ever be mutually beneficial? Can a situation be exploitative even if both parties come out ahead in some way?
Ooh, good question. And the SESAP actually anticipates this. They use the classic thought experiment of the desert hiker. Imagine someone lost in the desert, desperate for water, and someone comes along who's got a whole case of it. They offer to sell the hiker a bottle, but for an outrageous price. $1,000, let's say.
It's highway robbery, basically.
Totally. But think about it. The hiker, in that desperate situation, might be willing to pay. They get to live, the seller makes a huge profit, everyone technically benefits. But does that make it okay?
It feels wrong, doesn't it? Something just feels off about it, even though there's a kind of agreement.
Right. And I think what makes it feel wrong is that power imbalance. The seller is exploiting the hiker's dire need. And that leads us nicely into how philosophers have wrestled with this concept throughout history. We've got to go way back for this one, all the way to Aristotle in ancient Greece.
Ah, Aristotle,
Yeah.
the OG philosopher. I swear that guy had an opinion on everything. What did he have to say about what makes an economic exchange just?
Justice was his jam, so naturally he had thoughts on this. For Aristotle, a just exchange should embody reciprocity. The values of the goods being exchanged should be proportional. No one's getting ripped off.
That sounds reasonable enough, but
Mhm.
how do you even determine the proportionality of things? How do you compare the value of, say, a house versus a pair of shoes? Seems pretty subjective.
That's a fair critique. Aristotle didn't give us a clear formula for figuring that out. Now, let's fast forward a few centuries. We've got Thomas Aquinas chiming in during the 13th century. He was big on the idea of the just price.
Aquinas, the just price guy, if I remember correctly, wasn't his idea of a just price, basically just the market price.
Yeah.
What supply and demand dictate.
You got it. It's a much more dynamic view than Aristotle's fixed proportionality. But, hold on, Aquinas wasn't naive about market forces. He believed that sellers who, for example, used deception or took advantage of a temporary monopoly to jack up prices, they were acting unjustly.
So those people who, like, hoard hand sanitizer during a pandemic and then sell it for 10 times the price, Aquinas would have some words for them, I'm guessing.
Oh, absolutely. And let's not forget his views on usury lending money at those crazy interest rates. Aquinas saw that as taking unfair advantage of people's necessities, especially when they're desperate, when their consent isn't truly free.
So just because someone's in a tough spot, it doesn't give you a free pass to exploit them. Got it.
Yep. And this focus on necessity takes us to John Locke a few centuries later. The SB mentions this treatise of his, Vindictio, where he really goes deep on just and unjust prices.
John Locke, the property rights guy. I'm curious how that ties into exploitation.
Well, Locke, much like Aquinas, saw the just price as the market price. But he was very specific. It had to be the market price determined by general supply and demand, not by exploiting some particular buyer's vulnerability.
They give this great example in the Sessa. Imagine two ships carrying corn. One arrives in Dunkirk, where there's a famine and corn is desperately needed. The other one sails to Ostend, where everything's normal. Locke argues that it wouldn't be unjust to sell the corn at a much higher price in Dunkirk.
Exactly. And his logic was if merchants couldn't get those higher prices in, let's call them good markets, to offset potential losses in bad markets, like during a famine, well, no one would take the risk and trade would just collapse.
So it's a kind of pragmatic take on pricing, trying to account for the realities of the market. But Locke doesn't stop there, right? He does draw a line. He says it's unjust to exploit someone's individual distress, even if the overall market conditions would allow for some price fluctuation.
You're right. He uses the example of anchors. Like, say anchors normally go for £100. You can't charge a ship captain who's desperate £5,000 just because they're in dire straits. That's taking advantage of their specific situation, even if the market might allow for some wiggle room in price.
It's like he's saying, look, a just price has to be something more than just whatever the market will bear. There's an ethical dimension, too.
Totally. And this concern for the ethical dimension of economics gets even stronger as we move into the 19th century. We encounter figures like Thomas Hodgkin, who the Essay mentions as someone who really puts labor front and center when thinking about value and exploitation.
Hodgkin, wasn't he a bit of a radical for his time? How did his ideas about labor connect to exploitation?
Oh, he was definitely pushing the boundaries. He was heavily influenced by Locke's ideas about property rights, but he took it in a different direction. He believed that, yeah, you have a natural right to own what you create through your own labor, but then there's this artificial right of property claims based on, say, force or inheritance rather than actual work.
So he's saying, basically, that capitalists and landlords are exploiting people by profiting not from their own labor, but from controlling the means of production, which he saw as illegitimate.
Exactly. He saw them as parasites living off the work of others, and he even called out the state as complicit in this for enforcing these artificial property rights.
It's a pretty sharp critique of how economic systems can be set up to perpetuate inequality. And the ASEP mentions this other group of thinkers in the 19th century, the French industrialist school, who had a similar focus on what they call productive versus unproductive classes.
Right. They believed society was divided into those who create value through their labor, which for them included entrepreneurs and capitalists, at least in their managerial roles, and then those who, in their view, consume value without really producing it, like they'd lump in the army, the government, even the clergy.
So they saw taxes and tariffs as a kind of exploitation, where the unproductive folks are basically taking resources from the productive folks.
Yes. And they were big critics of things like monopolies and protectionist policies that shielded certain industries from competition. They argued those just benefit a select few at the expense of everyone else.
So even before we get to Marx, we've got these themes emerging, right? Power, unfairness, the distribution of resources, and the role the state plays in all of this. But of course, any discussion of exploitation is incomplete without talking about Karl Marx.
Absolutely. Marx's theory is probably the most influential and controversial account of exploitation ever put forward. Buckle up, because it's a whole deep dive in itself. It's fascinating, actually, because while Marx is best known for his critique of capitalism, his theory of exploitation wasn't limited to just that system. He saw it as a feature of, well, pretty much any society with distinct classes.
So it's not just about capitalists and workers for Marx. He's got a bigger historical picture in mind.
Exactly. He pointed to feudalism, for example, as a really clear case of exploitation. You've got the serfs working part of the time for their own survival, growing their own food and all that, but then another chunk of their time, they're working for the Lord, producing surplus that the Lord just appropriates.
Like a work for me for free on Tuesdays kind of deal, but baked into the whole social order.
That's a great way to put it. And Marx's argument is that under capitalism, it's still happening, just in a more obscured way. Because on the surface, it looks like workers are, freely entering into contracts, exchanging their labor for wages.
Right, but of course Marx famously argued that free exchange is kind of an illusion. Workers are forced to sell their labor power because they don't own the means of production. And the capitalists, they're skimming off this surplus value created by the workers. So tell me more about this surplus value. It seems pretty central to his whole theory.
Absolutely. For Marx, the value of anything, any commodity, whether it's a loaf of bread or a fancy car, is ultimately determined by how much labor time went into producing it. And that applies to labor power itself, meaning that under capitalism, wages would tend to hover around the subsistence level, just enough to keep workers alive and, well, working.
Just enough to get by and come back to work the next day. Sounds a bit bleak, doesn't it?
It is a rather stark view, I'll give you that. But here's the interesting part. Marx believed that labor has this unique quality. It can actually create more value than it takes to reproduce itself. A worker can produce, let's say, $10 worth of value in a day, but they only need $5 worth of goods to survive on that day.
So that difference, that extra $5, that's the surplus value. And that's what the capitalist gets to pocket as profit.
Precisely. Marx even imagined the worker's day being split into two parts. One where they're working to produce the value that's equivalent to their wage, basically, working for themselves. And then this other portion where they're generating that surplus value unpaid for the capitalist.
It's a bold claim, to say the least. And Marx got pretty technical with all of this, right? The SCP mentions these formulas he came up with, like the rate of exploitation, the organic composition of capital, the rate of profit. What was he trying to show with all that?
Yeah, those were his attempts to really map out how labor, capital, and profit all interrelate under capitalism. The rate of exploitation, for example, was this ratio of surplus value to wages. It's basically a measure of, how much unpaid labor is being extracted. Then you've got the organic composition of capital, which is about the ratio of what he called constant capital think machines, raw materials to variable capital, which is basically just the labor power itself.
And how does the rate of profit fit into all of this?
Right, that one brings it all together. It's the ratio of surplus value to the total capital invested, both the constant and the variable. Now, Marx's fundamental equation implied that those industries with a higher proportion of labor, a lower organic composition of capital, would also have a higher rate of profit.
But as the SAP points out, that prediction doesn't quite match up with reality. We don't always see labor-intensive industries being the most profitable. This is what led to that whole transformation problem for Marx, right?
And Marx himself recognized this and tried to address it in the third volume of Capital. His argument was that the relationship between value and price is a lot more complex than he initially laid out, and that market competition basically transforms value into prices. Whether or not his solution really works, though, that's something economists still debate.
It's definitely a complex issue. But even setting that aside, there's a more fundamental challenge to Marx's whole theory, right? I mean, that labor theory of value has been heavily criticized, especially by neoclassical economists, who argue that value is really subjective, based on what individuals want, their preferences, not just how many hours of labor went into something.
The SEPA does a good job summarizing those critiques, and yeah, they're valid points. I mean, it is hard to square the labor theory of value with, say, the value of things like land or natural resources, things that aren't directly produced by human labor. And how do you compare different kinds of labor? How much more valuable is the labor of a skilled surgeon compared to, say, someone working in a factory?
It's apples and oranges, basically, right?
Yeah.
So does that mean Marx's theory of exploitation is like dead in the water if the labor theory of value doesn't hold up?
Not necessarily. Some philosophers have argued that Marx's key insights can be salvaged, even without a strict labor theory of value. The philosopher G.A. Cohen, who gets a mention in the SEP, offered a pretty compelling defense along these lines.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does he pull that off?
So Cohen's argument is that, at its core, Marx's theory isn't really about capitalists literally taking the value that labor creates, but about them appropriating value from the products of labor. And his point is, labor is the only thing that actually produces the things that have value, even if it doesn't create value in some, like, metaphysical sense.
So even if value is ultimately subjective, like those neoclassical economists argue, it's still labor that creates the things people value.
Exactly. And for Cohen, that insight is enough to support Marx's claim that under capitalism, capitalists benefit unfairly at the expense of workers.
That's a clever defense of Marx. But the MP also raises some other issues with focusing solely on the forced aspect of exploitation, right? Like, Marx was really insistent that workers were forced to sell their labor power to capitalists because they lacked other options.
Right. But it makes you think, what if a society had this super strong social safety net, one that truly guaranteed everyone's basic needs, regardless of whether they worked? Would we still say that workers in that society are being exploited, even if they're not literally forced to work for survival?
It's a thought-provoking question.
Mm.
Because if someone chooses to work to get extra money,
Yeah.
for luxuries or travel or whatever, are they still being exploited if a capitalist profits from their labor? It seems like that question of fairness is still in play.
It totally is. And that leads us to the different ways philosophers have tried to define what makes an exchange unfair, which of course gets to the heart of exploitation. And the SB does a great job of laying out all the various approaches because there's really no one single definition that everyone agrees on, which makes it all the more interesting to talk about, of course.
More philosophical puzzles to unpack. So what are some of the main ways people have tried to understand this idea of unfairness and exploitation?
Well, one major distinction is between what's called substantive unfairness and procedural unfairness. And the SEPI does a good job of outlining both of those.
Okay, let's start with substantive unfairness then. What's that all about?
So substantive unfairness is basically about whether the terms of the deal itself are unfair, regardless of how that deal came about. Like, it's not about whether someone was coerced or tricked into the agreement, but whether the agreement itself is just inherently lopsided.
So it's not about the process, it's about the substance of the deal itself.
Precisely. And one common way to think about substantive unfairness is through the lens of equality. The idea is a truly fair exchange is one where both parties receive equal value. But of course, figuring out what counts as equal value is a whole can of worms.
Yeah, especially when you consider that value is often subjective, right? What one person considers super valuable might be totally worthless to someone else.
Exactly. That's one of the main challenges with using this idea of equality to judge the fairness of an exchange. This AP actually gives a few examples of how this can get messy. Like, if we try to determine if an exchange is fair based on the amount of labor time involved, how do you compare, say, skilled versus unskilled labor or the effort involved in different kinds of work?
Yeah, you're comparing apples and oranges there, aren't you?
Totally. And even if we shift away from labor time and try to use economic value as our measuring stick, we run into similar problems. I mean, if we let go of the idea of some kind of objective value and just embrace, like, subjective preferences, then any exchange where both parties willingly agree could be considered fair, simply because they both feel like they're getting more out of it than they're giving up.
So if I'm a diehard Star Wars fan and I'm willing to pay $100 for some rare Luke Skywalker action figure, and you happen to have one, but you don't care about Star Wars at all, and you're happy to take my money, is that a fair exchange? I'm clearly getting way more subjective value out of that deal than you are.
That's the tricky part. Economists sometimes talk about this thing called the social surplus, created by an exchange, which is basically the total gain in value for both parties. And some argue that a truly fair exchange is one where this social surplus is divided equally between the two parties.
So in the action figure example, maybe a fair price would be $50. We each walk away $50 richer based on our subjective valuations.
That's one way to look at it. But even that approach has some limitations. Think back to our desert hiker example. The person selling that water for $1,000, they're getting a much bigger share of the social surplus. But so is the person who, like, finds a rare painting at a garage sale for $10 because the seller just needs cash quickly.
So just splitting the social surplus in half doesn't always line up with our gut feeling about what's fair, especially when there's this big power imbalance involved.
Right, and that's led some philosophers to explore other criteria for substantive fairness, like this idea of sufficiency or focusing on basic needs.
So instead of worrying about equal slices of the pie, it's about making sure everyone has enough to meet their basic needs, regardless of the exchange.
Exactly. Philosophers like Ruth Sample and Jeremy Snyder have argued along these lines, saying that exploitation happens when someone takes advantage of another person's unmet basic needs in order to make a profit.
It's like seeing someone who's struggling to afford food, and instead of helping, You see it as an opportunity to, make a buck off their situation. Definitely feels exploitative.
It does, doesn't it? But even this approach runs into some snags, as the SEP points out. Like, is it always exploitative to engage in an exchange with someone whose basic needs aren't met, even if you're not making a profit? What if it's just two very poor people trading with each other?
It seems like the specifics of the situation and the power dynamics would matter a lot.
They totally do. And there's the question of how you actually apply this basic needs criterion to specific transactions. Like, what's a fair price for, say, an apple if we're trying to ensure the seller can meet their basic needs? It gets pretty complicated.
It sounds like there's no easy formula here. Are there any other approaches to substantive fairness out there?
Some philosophers have looked to game theory for inspiration, specifically this idea of bargaining solutions. The T-Pie mentions the Nash solution, which is a well-known one. It's basically an attempt to figure out what outcome rational agents would agree to in a bargaining situation where what's being divided up is the social surplus from the exchange.
So instead of abstract principles like equality or basic needs, it's about finding the most agreeable outcome based on what each person wants and what the potential gains are.
Right. The Nash solution tries to maximize the product of the gains for both parties. That might involve an equal split sometimes, but not always. It really depends on what each individual values.
It sounds a lot more like mathematically rigorous.
Hmm.
But are the outcomes that rational agents would agree to always morally fair? Those seem like potentially different things.
You've hit on a key point there. And the SB raises some important concerns about just relying on bargaining solutions to determine what's fair. For one thing, they tend to just accept the pre-bargaining situation, even if that starting point is already unjust. Like, if I'm negotiating with you from a position of weakness because of some past injustice, even the rational outcome might still be unfair.
It's like playing a game that's already rigged, right?
Yeah.
Even if you make all the right moves, you're still going to end up with a bad outcome if the rules of the game are messed up.
Exactly. And there's another really interesting point here. These bargaining solutions usually focus on rational outcomes, but do we actually need rationality for an exchange, to be fair?
I see what you mean. Like, what if two people make a deal that's totally irrational, bad for both of them, but let's say they happen to divide the social surplus proportionally. Would we say that exchange is unfair? Maybe not.
It does make you wonder if rationality is really the key to fairness. It seems like other things might matter more, like how well each party understands what they're agreeing to, their intentions, the broader social context. All of that helps us judge whether an exchange is truly fair.
Okay, so we've seen how tricky it can be to pin down this idea of substantive fairness. Trying to judge the fairness of an exchange based just on the terms of the deal itself. But what about those procedural issues we were talking about? How does that factor into exploitation?
Well, a lot of philosophers have focused on what's called procedural unfairness to explain why exploitation is wrong.
So instead of just looking at the outcome, who ends up with what, it's more about whether the process leading up to the agreement was messed up in some way.
Exactly. Like, was there deception involved, undue pressure? Did one party have way more information than the other? One really well-known procedural account comes from the philosopher Alan Wertheimer. The essay talks about his work. He argues that a truly fair price is basically the price something would go for in, like a hypothetical, perfectly competitive market. A market where everyone has all the relevant information and there's no coercion or pressure.
It's like a thought experiment almost, right? Trying to imagine this perfectly level playing field for economic exchanges. No one's being tricked, no one's being forced, and the price just reflects the true value of whatever's being exchanged.
That's the idea. Wertheimer argues that this fair market value approach, as he calls it, might not guarantee a price that's perfectly just in every sense, but it's a good way to weed out those really obvious cases of exploitation.
Sounds good in theory, but the SEP brings up some interesting challenges to Wertheimer's conditions. Like, what about information itself? Information can be valuable, right? I mean, think about things like education, expertise, or even just like insider knowledge. Is it inherently unfair for someone to profit from having more information?
That's a great point. We pay for information all the time. Tuition for school, fees for consultants, subscriptions to research journals. There's a difference between using knowledge legitimately and straight-up deception or fraud.
Right. And what about pressure? The SEP gives this example of someone who forgets their lunch and is willing to pay way more for a sandwich just because they're hungry. Is that exploitation? Doesn't seem like it.
That's a tough one. It seems like the degree of pressure matters and also where it's coming from. If someone's price gouging for food during a natural disaster, taking advantage of people's desperation, yeah, that's exploiting a really vulnerable situation. But for getting your lunch well, that's a vulnerability you kind of brought on yourself.
It's like the difference between, I don't know, a pushy salesperson and someone demanding a ransom to save your kid. Both are using pressure, but one is clearly way more ethically problematic.
For sure. I think it comes down to this. We need some notion of what's just in order to figure out when those factors like unequal information or pressure cross the line into unfairness. Maybe the fair price isn't one that eliminates all influence from those factors, but rather the price you'd find in a just market. However we define just, of course.
So it all circles back to those fundamental questions about justice, right? Now, the ESEPI also mentions this other procedural approach, one that focuses on property, associated with the philosopher John Rummer.
Ah, yes, rumor. He was a Marxist, but he actually felt that Marxist theory was a bit too narrowly focused on, just workers and capitalists at the point of production. He wanted to broaden things out, to look at the bigger picture of how property is distributed in a society.
So instead of just what's happening on the factory floor, it's about the whole system that creates the conditions for exploitation.
Exactly. Romer's argument was basically this. Exploitation happens when you have a group, let's call them Group S, and this group could actually improve their situation if they just withdrew from society, taking their own resources with them. But then you have this other group, Group S prime, who would be worse off without Group S.
So it's like saying, hey, we'd be better off if we took our labor and our land and just did our own thing, and the other group, the exploiters, would be left high and dry.
Right. And Romer actually differentiated between different types of exploitation based on what exactly Group S can withdraw with. So feudal exploitation, in his view, happens when the serfs would be better off if they could just take their labor, take their land, and, say, see ya to the Lord. No more obligations.
It's about who controls what and who benefits. And then for Romer, capitalist exploitation happens when workers would be better off if they could withdraw not just with their labor, but also with their share of the alienable assets, things like factories, machines, all the stuff you can own privately.
Yes, and then he even talks about socialist exploitation, which is where workers would be better off if they could also take their share of the inalienable assets, things like their skills and knowledge. It's pretty abstract, but it highlights those deeper structural issues.
It's about the rules of the game, not just the moves the players make. But the SP mentions that there's actually disagreement about whether this idea of historical injustice, like an unfair distribution of property in the past, is really necessary for exploitation to occur.
Ah, yes, that's a key point of debate. You have some philosophers like Hillel Steiner who believe that, yeah, you need some prior injustice for there to be exploitation. Like, if I can pay you a really low wage because I've unfairly limited your options, okay, that's exploitation. But if you just happen to be unskilled or if there's a lot of competition for jobs and you end up accepting a low wage, that's not necessarily exploitation, in his view.
So it's the difference between taking advantage of someone because you rigged the system versus them being in a tough spot because of circumstances that are, kind of outside your control.
Precisely. But then you have other philosophers, like Robert Goodin, who argue that exploiting someone's vulnerability is wrong, regardless of how that vulnerability came about. Whether it's historical injustice or just bad luck, if you're taking advantage, you're exploiting.
It makes you wonder, how far back do we have to go to figure out if a situation is exploitative? That brings up that desert hiker again. Is it exploitation to charge them $1,000 for water, even if they got lost due to their own bad decisions?
That's such a good example because it gets right to the heart of it. Some people would say, hey, it's still unfair to take advantage of the hiker's need, even if it's their own fault. Others might say, well, there's no prior injustice here, so it's different.
Yeah, there's definitely room for different intuitions there. Now, the CEP also mentions a related concern with Romer's approach, this focus on domination as a requirement for exploitation.
Right, Romer added this domination condition to try and exclude cases where, one group benefits at the expense of another, but it's not because of any direct control or coercion. He actually gives this funny example of, like, a really hardworking puritanical group that kind of looks down on this other lazy group, and somehow the lazy group's laziness actually motivates the Puritans to work harder.
It's a weird scenario, but Yeah, it doesn't really feel like exploitation in the usual sense, does it?
Not really. And some philosophers have pointed out that this domination condition seems kind of tacked on. Like it's not totally clear how it connects to that core idea of distributive injustice that Romer's theory is all about.
It does make you wonder if we need to look beyond just how things are distributed to really grasp exploitation. What about the attitudes of the people involved? Does that matter?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. And yeah, some philosophers argue that exploitation involves more than just unfairness. It also needs some kind of like morally problematic attitude on the part of the exploiter.
So it's not just about the outcome, but also about what's going on in the exploiter's head.
Exactly. Some focus on this idea of disrespect. Ruth Sample, for example, argues that exploitation means failing to respect the value of the person you're exploiting. Maybe that's by neglecting their basic needs or taking advantage of some past injustice or just treating them like a tool, a means to an end.
Like you're not seeing them as a full person, someone deserving of dignity and respect. They're just a source of profit to you.
Right. And Jonathan Wolff makes a similar point, arguing that exploitation fails to recognize that the person being exploited has value in themselves. But both Sample and Wolff ultimately kind of tie these ideas back to fairness. Like they're explaining why certain kinds of unfairness are also disrespectful, but disrespect itself isn't like a separate requirement for something to be exploitative.
So disrespect helps us understand exploitation better, but it doesn't necessarily change the definition of what counts as exploitation. What about other attitudes, like domination, for instance?
Well, there's this philosopher, Nicholas Frusalis, who the SF mentions, who actually offers a purely domination-based account of exploitation. And get this, he says exploitation doesn't even require unfairness. His whole thing is about one person using their power to get another person to do something and then benefiting from that.
So even if I offer you, I don't know, a fair wage, but you only accept it because you're totally dependent on me and have no other options, that's still exploitative, according to Versailles.
Yep, that's how he sees it. But of course, other philosophers push back against this. Richard Arneson, for example, argues that it's hard to see how taking advantage of someone's vulnerability is morally wrong unless it also involves some kind of unfairness. Like, if I'm selling you a sandwich at a perfectly reasonable price, even if you're starving and have no other choice, does that really feel exploitative?
It seems like you need both, right? The transaction has to be unfair, and the exploiter has to know it's unfair, or at least be, like, willfully blind to that fact.
That's the view that Benjamin Ferguson defends, and he gets a good chunk of space in this ep. His argument is that exploitation needs both an unfair transaction and this belief on the part of the exploiter that they're benefiting unfairly, or at least a culpable ignorance of that fact. And this helps to explain both, why we think exploitation is wrong and why we hold exploiters morally responsible.
It's about holding people accountable for knowingly taking unfair advantage, not just for benefiting from situations that might be unfair due to stuff outside their control.
Absolutely. And I think this brings us to some really important big picture questions, like just how bad is exploitation, morally speaking? And when, if ever, are we justified in doing something about it?
Yeah, how wrong is exploitation, and when does it warrant intervention?
Well, when exploitation clearly harms someone and they didn't consent to it, I think the answers are pretty straightforward. It's wrong to harm others, and it's definitely something we should try to prevent. But things get a lot more complicated when we're talking about those cases of exploitation that are, well, mutually beneficial and consensual.
Our desert hiker is back, I see. Both parties technically benefit from that water sale, even if the price is totally unfair. So is it still wrong? And should someone step in and stop it?
That's where this idea called the non-worseness claim comes into play, which the SFP does a good job explaining. The claim is basically this. If person A has no obligation to interact with person B at all, and then their interaction actually helps both of them, and they both agree to it well, then it can't be worse than not interacting at all.
So either it's better to help someone on unfair terms than not help them at all, or maybe taking advantage of their need isn't actually as bad as we think it is.
That's the dilemma. And it has all these implications for thinking about things like price gouging. If someone's providing a good or service that people desperately need, even if they're charging a huge markup, aren't they doing more good than someone who just sits back and does nothing?
It's a good point. It really makes you think. But okay, even if we say that mutually beneficial exploitation is wrong, does that automatically mean the state should intervene?
That's a separate question. Some people would argue that the state should only get involved when there's harm or a violation of rights. But there could be other justifications for intervening, Like, you could make a paternalistic argument we need to protect people from making choices that are bad for them,
Yeah.
even if they consent to them.
Like stopping someone from, I don't know, selling a kidney for a tiny sum of money because they don't fully understand the risks.
Exactly. Or you could argue for intervention on more strategic grounds. Like, if someone is using a monopoly to charge exorbitant prices, maybe the best thing to do is just ban those prices outright, hoping that that leads to a fairer market overall.
So it's less about punishing people after the fact and more about trying to create the conditions for fairness in the first place.
Right. And the SIP makes a good point here. We don't always have to ban or prohibit things. We could try to address the vulnerabilities that make people more susceptible to exploitation in the first place. Things like strengthening the social safety net, improving access to education, or helping workers organize so they have more bargaining power.
It's about addressing the root causes, not just the symptoms.
Exactly. And this brings us to some real-world areas where these debates about exploitation play out, which the essay briefly touches on. Things like sweatshop labor, commercial surrogacy, and even the debate over universal basic income.
All areas where those questions about fairness, power, and the role of the state are front and center.
Absolutely. Take sweatshops, for example. Critics argue that those low wages, unsafe working conditions, that lack of respect for workers, it's all exploitative, even if those workers choose to take those jobs.
It's about whether their consent is truly free when the alternative is, extreme poverty. But then there's that other question, right? The question of whether sweatshops, even if they are exploitative, might still be better than no jobs at all.
There's that non-worseness claim popping up again, and we see similar issues with commercial surrogacy. Is it exploitative to pay women to carry pregnancies, especially when you look at those huge disparities in pay between, say, surrogates in wealthy countries and surrogates in developing countries?
And is it even ethically okay to commodify reproductive labor in the first place? These are tough questions.
They really are. And the ESSO even mentions the debate over universal basic income. That idea of a guaranteed income for everyone, regardless of whether they work. Some people worried that this could actually lead to a new form of exploitation, with those who choose not to work benefiting from the labor of those who do.
It's a really interesting twist. So instead of workers being exploited by capitalists, it's those who work being exploited by those who don't.
It just shows how complex these issues of fairness and reciprocity become in a world where work is changing so rapidly with automation and all these new ways of generating income.
So where does this leave us? What have we learned from our deep dive into exploitation?
Well, I think it's safe to say that exploitation is one of those concepts that's a lot easier to point to than to define precisely. It's about unfairness, it's about power imbalances, it's about individuals and systems taking advantage of vulnerabilities, but exactly what makes something exploitative and what we should do about it, those are questions that philosophers have been debating for centuries, and the debate continues.
We've seen how those debates have evolved over time, from ancient Greece right up to the present. And they'll only get more complex, I think, as we face new challenges like globalization, the rise of automation, and those big shifts in how we think about work and income.
Totally. And I think one final thought to leave our listeners with is this. In a world where exploitation can be so subtle, so systemic, and sometimes even mutually beneficial in a way, what is our responsibility as individuals? Do we have a duty to examine those systems we're a part of, to ask tough questions about where our benefits are coming from, even when we seem to be coming out ahead?
That's a good question to ponder. Until our next deep dive, happy pondering, everyone.
Happy pondering.